Welcome to our webinar, 400 Years of American Food Policy, Challenges and Equitable Solutions. Before we begin, all of us at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, education, and learning across the country takes place on the occupied and unceded lands of many Native American tribes. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its long history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this country and whose practices and spiritualities were, are, and shall always be tied to the land and the water. Today's webinar is the fifth in our 2022 Climate Justice webinar series as part of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. The CHEF Fellowship is a program that recognizes the need for more diversity in climate and health leadership, and a sharper focus on equitable climate solutions. The goal of the fellowship is to empower doctors of color from populations that face greater burdens from climate effects and are underrepresented in medicine to become leaders in climate and health equity, education, advocacy, and policy solutions. I'm Dr. Venice Curry, the Western Associate Director of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. Also joining me from the consortium to run the webinar is Program Assistant Clarissa Payton. She will be available through the chat to answer any questions, any technical questions during the webinar. Our other team members on the webinar are Program Director, Dr. Mark Mitchell, and Program Manager, Dr. Kimberly Williams. The webinar series is hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health and is held for 1 hour. Let me just tell you who we're hearing from today. Today, we are honored to have Jordan Curry Carter, Chef Western Program Manager, to present to us. Rather than use our time to provide further description of his impressive work, we are placing a link of his bio in the chat. As a healthcare provider, it is important that you consider the role of the healthcare systems and providers play in maintaining health and proper nutrition, and how climate is now and will even more so in the future affect health and nutrition. In this webinar, Jordan will talk about American food policy throughout our history, which has resulted in the exacerbation of the wealth gap and the nutrition gap between whites and non-whites in urban and rural settings. The general format for today's webinar will be a 35-minute presentation by Jordan, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers from our audience. Our webinar is held from 1 hour on the second Friday of each month from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing as part of the Equity Resources page on the consortium's website. We ask that you put comments, links to any resources that you may recommend, or any questions that you may have for the presenter in the chat box at any time during the presentation. We will get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A. Please keep yourself muted so we are not interrupted by background noise. And Jordan, you may begin.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. And good afternoon to everybody. My name is Jordan Curry Carter. I use they and he pronouns, and just want to get my screen sharing up. And are folks able to hear me okay, as well as seeing the PowerPoint? Okay, excellent. So I want to begin first by engaging in this conversation and session around 400 years of American food policy, challenges and equitable solutions with a question to you, just to really get us going with America's quote unquote founding. And I want to just pause for a moment for you to place into the chat, what do you know about America's founding, or what are some things that you've heard about with regards to America's founding? So I want to just pause here for a moment and invite you to share anything that comes top of mind in the chat. And I'll hold for just another moment. So see misrepresentation, aggressive, destruction of native lands, theft, genocide, founded at the expense of BIPOC communities and culture. Yes, thank you all. Eurocentric story, excellent, founded by imperial power seeking. So please continue to put those offerings into the chat. But I wanted to just really get us going in the frame. And I want to offer to us a framework of really looking at America's founding in the session today, really through a lens of a through line of stolen land, stolen lives, stolen labor, and stolen resources. And so I want you to hold that in mind as we go through today's session. So first off, we begin with often what is shared as Christopher Columbus and the successful sail across the Atlantic, discovering North America as the first. But in reality, this paved the way for European colonization and the exploitation of indigenous peoples. Similarly, some years later, and folks may be familiar with this given the 400 years of remembrance that took place in 2019, there was a huge emphasis on this and the point of Fort Monroe in Virginia, formerly or sometimes referred to as Point Comfort. And really what I wanted to just emphasize here is the beginning of the idea and the seeds planting of the idea of chattel slavery with the original transportation theft, which then led to ideals around a slavery system that would be based on race and lifetime servitude, which would replace some of the current infrastructure that had been in place around indentured servitude at the time. So with this image, really wanting to just give some context for the Black and enslaved population as we look at a timeline from 1790 to 1880. And the blue line there, it gives you the total population. The black line there is Black people that were enslaved, and the gray line is Black people that were free at the time. So I want to just share this with you for context of really looking at that 1860 mark as we are approaching the 4 million mark in terms of Black people that were enslaved. I also want to just reiterate the explicitness with regards to language of all levels of government, but particularly starting here with the federal government, with legislation like the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And I just share this with you for a moment to again provide context for where we're beginning, as this being something passed through Congress and signed into law by President Jackson. Similarly here, wanting to provide context for the Trail of Tears, again, something that's taught often in public schools, K through 12 education, but it's often taught in a context that far stretches or indicates cognitive dissonance with regards to what actually took place as we think about the Trail of Tears and the removal and relocation of indigenous populations that took place between 1830 and 1870. And so this map is really to provide you with context for what that trail looked like with regards to 5,043 miles traveled with regards to folks being displaced and relocated. I also want to share again in the context of what is shared often and taught with regards to manifest destiny, first coined by John O'Sullivan the belief that the US is destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. So again, wanting to share this language alongside this very famous image, showing you what this expansion looks like. We won't have time to go through this video, but I wanted to share what may be familiar to some, which was a Schoolhouse Rock video called Elbow Room, which is about a 3-minute clip that really goes into the detail. And this was taught in my public education experience, as well as hearing from others in years since, with regards to the ways in which we are continuing to teach children about what Western expansion looked like, and the narrative with which that's discussed here in this video in the context of land theft, lives lost, labor and resources taken under the context of something like we needed more elbow room. And that was the context and rationalization, or rationale rather, for expanding and continuing to move west. So again, moving into this piece now, moving into enslavement and economic development. The first point here that I really want to reiterate is around the economy of the US being built on agriculture. And not just any agriculture, but again, agriculture in the context of stolen land, labor, lives, and resources. And the planting and harvesting of cash crops such as rice, cotton, wheat, sugarcane, which at the time was producing 75% of the world's cotton before the Civil War. I also want to indicate here this last piece around apartheid policies, which made it illegal for enslaved Black people to learn to read or write. And there's a lot of context in terms of what it looked like when folks did not follow those kinds of policies or rules, and rather had desire for self-determination. Similarly here, with regards to early statehood, we see subsistence farming was dominant in the US prior to and during much of the American Industrial Revolution, which started with cotton mills in 1793. And we also see here, as the US industrialization continued and work for rural farm workers declined, Americans moved to urban areas in droves looking for factory work. And so by the time of 1910 to 1920, that shift had fully taken place with regards to more folks being situated in urban centers. I also here want to bring forth 40 acres and a mule, which is often referred to, and it feels timely that we discuss this just a few weeks following what is now discussed as Juneteenth, with that being the newest federal holiday. But in 1865, Union General William Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15, declaring newly freed Black people be promised 40 acres of land and a mule as reparations. There were 400,000 acres of land that were designated for this purpose. Again, we see that following Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Jackson revokes this special order, and the calls for reparations, which are still alive and well today, have continued in that order. I also think it's worth noting here, as we think about the evolution of, we think about the enslavement of Black people, we think about the end of slavery and Reconstruction, which then is immediately followed by Jim Crow apartheid policies, where Southern states further codify a system of laws and practices to subordinate Black people. And you can see these images here which will likely not be new images for folks, and are very much the experiences that I've heard from my family who were alive, kind of coming out of this time, who experienced this apartheid, both in the South and in the North. So here again, wanting to focus on agriculture practices and the reality that freed Black people had minimal employment options, again, in the context of these laws, leading to sharecropping on white-owned land. And many Black people were chronically indebted to white landowners and local merchants. What does this mean? This means that practices were in place such that interest rates were higher to loan equipment, to use seeds or fertilizers for agriculture. Similarly, the cost of rent was higher, and laws made it illegal to sell crops that were harvested to anyone other than the white-owned landlord that they were working for, which then led to severely undervalued crops. And again, you continue this cycle of putting folks into a situation where, again, they're not able to exercise self-determination. So I want to shift here just to kind of move us into the 1930s, redlining in the New Deal America. And so I have this resource here, which comes from Mapping Inequality, which is a project out of the University of Richmond in Virginia. And it provides a lot of context. You can see here the dots indicating what redlining looked like across many cities across the US. And I want to just go a little bit deeper into a couple of these just to provide some context for what's available to you and something that you can take outside of this to look at where you're specifically located. And there may be a redlining map that could be informative for what you're seeing in your community today. So again, wanting to just remind folks that redlining was really a systematic process of like a stoplight system from green to red in terms of where investments would be made in communities. So green here we have best, blue still desirable, yellow there definitely declining, and D hazardous, right? And so you can then see that matched with this map of Denver. And what I want to do is just go a little bit deeper. What do they mean by A to D? So the language here that comes from the Homeowners Loan Corporation that you can see here. Area A, hotspots where good mortgage lenders will, with available funds, are willing to make their maximum loans, perhaps up to 70 or 80% of the appraisal. And then moving us down to C and D. C neighborhoods were characterized by obsolescence and infiltration of lower grade populations. Good mortgage lenders are more conservative in this third grade or C area and hold commitments under the lending ratio for the A and B areas. As we go deeper into D here, we have characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable populations, or an infiltration of it. They recommended lenders refuse to make loans in these areas or on a conservative basis. And I share this with you and want to move us along just to go a little bit deeper here. And I'm going to just clear the annotation. Just to, again, provide some context here for the city of Denver, which some of you may be familiar with. But again, just to show you the distinction between A and D here. A being a green area, house recently sold to a Jew, and since the area was begun 3 to 4 years ago, the Army Air Corps technical school has been located a short distance to the southeast. The extent to which this will be detrimental to the exclusive area cannot yet be determined. So this is the language that's being offered in the A area. So I want to give you that directly opposed to, or in comparison to D12, an old area now occupied by a combination of Negroes, Mexicans, and a transient class of workers. The west and northwest part of it is Denver's closest approach to a slum district. So again, this is the language that has been archived and is available for all of the cities, for a number of cities that the University of Richmond has really compiled all of this data. And the last point that I want to share with regards to redlining before moving beyond it is really, again, just the context of the federal government with the Federal Housing Administration having an underwriting manual in the 1930s that really provided the blueprint, if you will, for the stoplight system that was then replicated. And we're going to just talk, we'll get to this a little bit later, but this really wanting to lay a foundation for these policies and that were put in place and what the legacy of these policy decisions looks like in present day context. And so moving a bit along, want to just cover briefly the Wagner Act of 1935, which was passed by Congress and signed by FDR. And it established and recognized the legal rights of workers to do the following. First, to organize and join labor unions. Second, to collective bargaining. It also, thirdly, here established the National Labor Relations Board, which was a governmental body which oversaw worker complaints. What I want to indicate here and why I bring this to you today is that this policy of 1935 excluded agriculture and domestic workers. So what did it exactly exclude them from? It excluded them from joining labor unions. It excluded them from collective bargaining, and it excluded them from a governmental body that oversaw worker complaints. So I want to just pause here with a poll question that Clarissa will get up for us. And the question that we wanted to gauge with you all today is, when you hear the term, see the term food deserts, do you agree? Do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree that food desert is the best way to describe communities with minimal access to nutritious food? So we'll give you maybe 10 more seconds to complete this. And then we'll share the results. And Clarissa, thank you. So thank you. So of the 36 responses we have, and climbing, we'll hold for just another moment. See if we can get this participation up from 68%. All right, we'll take it. So based on the responses we have, we see 26% strongly agree, 39% agree, 29 disagree percent, and lastly, there are 5% strongly disagree. So thank you for engaging with this poll. Really appreciate that and your thoughts here. And I want to just move us along to some resources that you could explore with regards to looking at this. And I'll share this later on, but just speaking specifically about the reading article, Food Apartheid, the Root of the Problem with America's Groceries. This is an article from years ago from Karen Washington that really provides a lot of context and insight and really speaks to, again, that connection between redlining and how those policy decisions of the past, how that legacy is playing out as we think about communities in present day, and the fact that food is essential for our lives, and that a food desert is a non-natural occurring reality in which policy decisions, zoning, legislation, structural violence has led to this deterioration of self-determination that creates a condition where you have communities that have an oversaturation of foods, as we'll see here, that are not essential to their lives. So oversaturation of low nutrient processed food and a lack of access to nutritious foods. Similarly here, going up to the top, we see food insecurity, 14% of all households, and seeing numbers of 26% of Black and 22% of Latinx households. And so again, just that connection between where we've been and where we find ourselves contemporarily. I want to move us a little bit deeper into agriculture's effect on climate. And currently, as it sits, 9% of greenhouse gas emissions, 52% of methane emissions, 84% of nitrous oxide, and 17% of fossil fuel use is coming directly from our agriculture activities. And lastly here, 70% of the water that's used globally is being used for agriculture. So it's extremely water intensive and plays a role in contributing to the droughts, which we have seen for decades, especially in different parts of the West. Similarly, wanting to dive a little bit deeper into how climate changes affecting food. And what we see first and foremost is with regards to food production, processing, and distribution. So crop yields have been declining. We see that warmer temps result in fewer chill hours, which impact nuts, tree fruits, as well as avocados. Ozone is affecting soybeans, wheat, oats, etc. We also see heat stress reduces milk and egg production, and that is playing an impact in terms of both cows as well as chickens and where they are in the food production. And lastly, there a reduction of proteins and micronutrients such as calcium, zinc, and iron as a result of carbon dioxide. Similarly here, we're also impacting the waters. And so what we can see here is ocean acidification from carbon dioxide. On the bottom left, I have a couple images here that really speak to that acidification. And we also see drought prevents stream spawning, contaminated shellfish from floods, as well as algae blooms. Also worth noting, and what really wanting to emphasize in the context of this discussion is how climate is also impacting Indigenous cultures, specifically Indigenous people that have contributed the least to climate change, who are already seeing some of the worst impacts with regards to rising sea level. And so what you have imaged here at the top right is American Samoa. On the bottom left, Puerto Rico, and the bottom right, you can see Micronesia. And particularly wanting to offer these photos and images, as well as particularly in the bottom right, that image with regards to sea level and the projections for 2030 and 2050 based on where you see the water presently. Also now wanting to move into the Farm Bill as the primary legislation that is driving farming policies in the US. This bill originally enacted by FDR in 1933. It's updated every 5 years and consists of 12 titles. The largest piece that we'll just do a little bit of talking about in a moment is just the nutrition programs, loan servicing, as well as conservation. And I want to just share a brief image here, just for a scan, not to go deep into this, but just to provide you context for the numbers, the sheer volume of numbers at a 5 and a 10-year baseline of $428 billion over 5 years and $867 billion over 10 years, with nutrition programming such as SNAP or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program being a large program within that nutrition bucket. So commodity crops, we see that really what I wanted to emphasize here is the 3 largest crops of corn, soybean, and barley. And corn is you can see the large distinction between these 3, even though they are the largest 3. Corn at 14 billion bushels. And so I wanted to just go a little bit deeper into corn as we move through this and move into the solutions. So how is this corn being used? Corn is currently used in 95% of feed grain, meaning that cattle, pigs, and chickens are now consuming corn at very high levels. We're also seeing that corn is being used heavily in consumer and commercial products. And lastly here, it's being used for conversion into ethanol. However, corn requires 29% more fossil fuel energy for this conversion than what it's actually producing on the back end. So I briefly wanted to just speak on the USDA and some of the discriminatory settlements, not to go through these, but just to give you context of the ways in which these lawsuits over the last 20 or so years have really come down, leading to a $1.2 billion settlement for Black farmers, $1.3 billion settlement for Latinx farmers, $760 million for Native American farmers, and lastly there, again, a $1.2 billion settlement for female farmers. And we also see that food production within its current context, California is producing over 1/3 of US veggies, 66% of fruit and nuts, and the food system accounts for 10% of the US's overall energy consumption. And also wanting to note here, 20% of all US fossil fuels are used to power stages of food production. So wanting to close out really here with food waste before getting into those solutions, and really heavily emphasizing here that 30 to 40% of this food supply is currently being wasted. There's projection from 2010 that 133 billion pounds of food were wasted, which equated to somewhere around $161 billion of groceries. And what's really concerning about this food waste is that it's ending up in landfills, releasing methane as the food decomposes. On the back end, again, of 70% of global water being used for ag and food production. So as I dive into these equitable solutions before we close out, really wanting to emphasize that these solutions are necessary, but not sufficient. And I want to just provide that context as we move through these quickly. The first is with regards to a land return that took place in 2019, where the city of Eureka returned 200 acres of land to the Wiyot tribe. This is something that the Wiyot people had been organizing around since the 1970s as a result of a massacre that took place on February 26th in 1860, in which white men residents from Eureka killed 250 Wiyot people, women, children, and elders during a world renewal ceremony. The second solution is really around reparations, and HR 40, which was first introduced by John Connors in 1989, which for the first time after 40 years of being introduced has passed out of committee, which means that there are still so many steps before any action is taken, again, not to actually provide reparations, but to commission a study on the validity of engaging in reparations. So I share this slide as well as this quote from the ACLU with regards to an estimated value of Black people enslaved in the North economy in 1860 at $3.5 billion, otherwise in present terms as $100 billion. So just wanting that to sink in the context of this image from 1619, as you look at 246 years of American slavery, 89 years of segregation or apartheid policies, and kind of 1954 to present day. There's some resources here which we'll dive deeper into later as my time is coming to a close. But I did want to close by sharing these last two slides with regards to the Farm Bill and opportunities that exist within that space as we think about climate. This was a piece that came out in 2014 titled "Only 60 Years of Farming Left If Soil Degradation Continues." And these three quotes I wanted to list here, you can see that first one with regards to generating 3 centimeters of soil takes 1,000 years. And if the current rates of degradation continue, all of the world's topsoil will be gone in 60 years, which was shared by a senior UN official. We also see here 95% of food comes from soil, 95%. And lastly, they're losing 30 soccer fields of soil each minute. So as we come to a close, the last offering that I wanted to make today was really in the context of addressing climate change in the Farm Bill, which is, again, comes up every 5 years. And particularly thinking about ways that within the Farm Bill, they can incentivize soil health, establish conservation compliance requirements, fund climate change research outreach, and work with land-grant universities, decreasing methane emissions and other greenhouse gas contributors, while also investing in renewable energies within the context of agriculture and food production. And lastly, incentivizing climate risk management while also eliminating the disincentives to engage in climate-friendly practices. So I wanted to just close with those offerings, as well as this image of Fannie Lou Hamer, and her famous quote that nobody's free until everybody's free. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Dr. Gabay.
Thank you, Jordan, for that very enlightening presentation. 400 years and 45 minutes is still impressive, so we appreciate that. Now we will take questions from the audience. I remind you that you can type questions into the chat box, and we will get to as many as we can. We ask that you please take a moment to complete our survey. The link is now in the chat. And Kimberly, what questions do we have for Jordan?
Let's see, I don't have questions yet, but lots to dissect. 400 years. There was a lot there. And several comments. Myth of racial democracy. I saw a lot of that as Jordan went through his slides. Let's see. Okay, one question. Thank you, Dr. Linda Rudolph. Do you have any specific recommendations about key provisions that we should be supporting in the Farm Bill?
Sure, thanks, Dr. Rudolph. So I think the primary piece that I wanted to offer was just in the context of using that framework of the Farm Bill and pushing legislators to really move away from, well, I guess in the context of conservation, really thinking about how do we increase that? I know I shared the image very briefly, but conservation was perhaps 6 or 7% of where these hundreds of billions of dollars are going. And we know that we're currently and have been in the context of a climate emergency. And so we don't have time, if we want to exist, and if we want other non-human animals to exist, to continue to move forward with minimal funding being put towards conservation and continuing to invest heavily in corn, which has largely extracted resources from the soil. So that's one piece that I would offer in the context of a specific focus on within the Farm Bill.
Thank you for that, Jordan. Okay, our next question. Have you explored analogs in the colonial world, such as Brazil, where 4 times more enslaved Africans landed and is currently at 50% of its population is Black?
Yeah, so this is, thank you for that question, Milton Curry. This is definitely a piece in terms of just thinking about the context in which racism is showing up in a global context, particularly anti-Black racism, and a long history with regards to the ways in which that has impacted populations both here, but also in Brazil, and as far as folks have been placed in the world. I think that number 2 is somewhat connected to this with regards to aquaponics and urban farming. And so I'll just speak to that real quick. And I think that these are definitely solutions that can be offered. But again, whether it's aquaponics, urban farming, or even some of the kind of other aspects that have been coming into place as we think about indoor farming or other aspects like that, it has to be working at scale, particularly in the context of farms of soil, and that quote around 95% of our food currently coming from soil. So if we're trying to replace that with aquaponics or urban farming, we have to resource local communities and regional communities at scale so that they can actually materialize food production in a way that folks will be able to not just survive, but thrive.
Thank you for that, Jordan. And we have several questions on how we can decrease food waste. Any comments there?
Yeah, so food waste is, again, another piece here. There's some with regards to policy in terms of food that's wasted based on dates. And there, I know that there's been a lot of talk around needing to do more research with regards to expiration dates on food. Is it actually bad at that time? And is that contributing to some of the food waste? There's also, I know that there's some, I mean, this requires individual people as well as policymakers making the decision to really invest in composting at scale. I know that in DC, there has been an effort over many years to ensure that they now have composting available at different farmers markets across the city, where you can at least participate in a circular kind of disposal of your food on the back end. But again, it leads to, with regards to our overproduction of food to begin with, and the misrepresentation, where in the US context specifically, you have things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes at incredible rates. And at the same time, you have folks who don't have access to nutritious food because of the outcomes that are currently, because of the food production process leading to the particular outcomes that we have. So there's a need to really re-envision what that looks like on the front end, but I would also offer that there are some of those aspects on the back end in regards to composting and really making that cities again or regional food systems coming together to create economies where food is locally grown as well as being disposed of in ways that methane is not being released as it currently has been.
And I think along those lines, do you see some things that some of the large organizations can do to help the smaller communities and farmers to alleviate food insecurity in some areas?
Yeah, I think that a big piece, and I do feel like that article I shared with regards to food apartheid from Karen Washington really speaks to this, because it's not only with regards to the food, but it's also about self-determination. So at this point, it's not just about, can we get another grocery store to come to a community, which is one, hard on its own to do because folks are using data from redlining to talk about whether or not there's enough density or enough money in a particular area for a grocery chain to come in. But you also have the fact that there's distrust with regards to, is this a space that I want to engage in? I know that there's been a lot of efforts around farmers markets that come places, but there's distrust with regards to, is this a signal that displacement or gentrification is around the corner for me, because there has never been a farmers market here for me, and now there is. And what does that mean when I see what that's done in other parts of the city? So the biggest thing that I would say is, how are you connecting with folks who are most impacted in these communities and working with them to develop a solution and ceding power to them in that solution process, as opposed to being an outsider organization that has resources and saying, I want to support you all, but only if we do it in this particular way.
Wonderful, thank you. Do you have any thoughts on advancing regenerative agricultural practices as a means of conservation?
Yeah, that's a question I'd probably like to come back to, but I think that a heavy emphasis is that, yes, I think, again, we need to be doing everything that we have available with regards to regenerative agriculture, but also the soil piece is so critical, because if we don't begin to move away from these extractive food production tactics, there won't be the ability to produce in some of the places, and we're going to need to move to other land that hasn't been, that still has access to soil. So I think that that's a big piece with regards to using all the tools that we have, as well as using different cover crops, and really kind of moving back to some of the indigenous practices with regards to thinking about the land in the context of us being a part of the land, as opposed to owning the land and the land being something for our extraction and disposal.
Oh, I like that answer. That was a good answer. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And there are several good ones here. Okay, you mentioned that conversion of corn into ethanol for gasoline supplements costs 29% in terms of additional greenhouse gas emissions. Are there supplements in the Farm Bill for corn for ethanol production?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Curtis. That's something I'd have to look into that and get back to you. But I do know that corn is being produced at the highest level again at 14 billion, when we see the next highest commodity crop production at 4 billion, because of these thoughts around what corn can be used for. So I'd have to look to see specifically what the subsidy or supplement may be within the Farm Bill, but I know that it is one of the leading indicators for why we see corn at such a higher rate in terms of its production.
Well, I know this discussion could go on much longer, but we do need to wrap up this session. So I would like to thank our speaker and to thank all of you for participating in our webinar series. I hope that you found it useful and informative. As a reminder, these webinars are held on the second Friday of the month. The next webinar is scheduled for August the 12th, and the topic is farm workers and energy conservation. Before you leave, we ask that you take a moment to complete the webinar survey if you haven't already. And again, the link is in the chat. Support for this webinar series was made possible with funding from Johnson & Johnson, the Energy Foundation, and the American College of Physicians. This now concludes our session. We hope that you have a great day and a safe weekend. Thank you.